19 games into the season, time to talk some X's and O's from Nets basketball. It's going to be Lucas Kaplan of NetsDaily, breaking it all down, the offense, the defense, what to expect going forward. Ben Simmons as well. We'll get into that. But first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day of the week. I'm Doug Norrie. You know that. You've been listening to the podcast for a while. No Adam Armbrecht over there today. Instead, massive upgrade. Lucas Kaplan from NetsDaily, also from Swish Theory, here to break down some of the X's and O's, the daily coverage that he's basically doing every single day on his own, going out there talking Nets basketball. Just a quick reminder for those of you that are jumping on the podcast, this podcast is brought to you by our good friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download the Game Time app today. Lucas, you have probably read him. Hopefully, if you haven't, over at NetsDaily, it's time to go make sure you're doing that over there. If not, you want to just maybe probably the best, I would say probably the best X's and O's Nets Twitter follow there is right now, at Lucas Kaplan _ Lucas, how's it going, man?
Thank you, man. Thank you for the introduction and happy to be here. You know, I'd say I probably know more about Nets basketball than I know about any other thing, especially in the last 3 months. So I think this is a good use of our time.
It's good, man. Niche stuff is the best. If anyone wants to get into content stuff, drill down niche as far as you go. If we could go even more granular than Nets, like just go on the player level, we get there. But I'm not sure there's a total appetite for it. All right, we got a ton to talk about today. 19 games into the season, Nets 10-9. I mean, we can rank where we are in terms of like where we thought the team would be up until this point. If you thought 10-9 was reasonable, if you're surprised by this, I guess let's just start there. Knowing the record, knowing the point differential, kind of seeing how these first almost 20, we're almost to the 25% mark through the season. Where would you say this season has landed so far in terms of just expectations going in? Do you think they're better? You think it's worse? Do you kind of neutral? Like, where do you on a high level? How do you feel about the Nets, through these first 19 games?
Yeah, I think it's a good time to benchmark just with the in-season tournament, this kind of break. I feel like it's pretty much a quarter. Even if it's not actually a quarter through the season, I feel pretty good about it. I think the first thought that I have is that they are more watchable than I thought they'd be. They're a little bit more fun. And I know that's not, the be all end all. Like the Magic are 13-6, but with their offense, it can be kind of a struggle to watch. So these things don't always correlate, but they're a fun team. Every game's close. And then on top of that, I think you have to be pretty satisfied with the 10-9 record. I mean, it's been a hard part of the schedule, undeniably. Vegas had their over-under at 37.5 wins. So if you just want to go by that on the surface, they're outpacing expectations. But overall, I would say that I would be pretty happy with the start. Obviously, a couple of those losses could have turned into wins, but you could say that going the other way too. Really, I think what everyone's been talking about, offense is better than we thought. Defense, not so much. And that's contributed to both the record and them being a little bit more enjoyable.
I think it's good to remember. We try to say this all the time on the podcast, is like to examine your priors, right? It's like, where were you if you knew they were 10-9 and you knew that like some of these other things, like Simmons had missed a ton of games and Cam Johnson had missed games and Claxton, like all these, Cam Thomas, all these injuries. If you knew they're in 10-9, you have to just sort of evaluate that from a feeling pretty good about this standpoint. And actually, I'm really glad you said the part where they're fun to watch. I think that's probably something I've underrated. Although when you said it, it was kind of like a little aha moment where it's like, yeah, they have been actually pretty entertaining. It's not a slog. I think it was in the range of outcomes to be a slog, especially after we saw like how they ended last year. Like if you think back to like even the Philly series, it's like, oh, we're just going to get Spencer Dinwiddie into matchups on bigs, and that's what we're going to see just sort of like over and over and over again for the rest. And it's like, doesn't end up being that way. So I think you putting it like that they have been entertaining. is probably pretty important for fans to remember. And I also, I mean, would you agree that, you mentioned the close games too. I think that fans tend to like want to see those close games and all want to have them all attributed to be wins. But I mean, does it factor in the fun part of you? It's like they've basically been in every game, even the losses too. I think there's 2 games where they could probably be qualified as out of them, right? Boston, and that's kind of it, right? Maybe one more game. Would you say like that's sort of like what's weighing in on where you land on them?
That's a big part of it. I think obviously my perspective, our perspective, covering them can be a little different than just from a fan's point of view. But even then, I doubt fans are unhappy with the fact that they're watching a bunch of good basketball games. I think that's what you're going to get from a team with a net rating that's close to, neutral. You're just going to find yourself in close games. But I do think the one thing I was wrong about is that I thought like, okay, injuries could really derail this team. I thought they maybe weren't going to be able to survive, if you had told me they'd experienced the injuries they'd have, I thought that would be way more of a roadblock than what it's turned out to be. Now, I was thinking more maybe Mikal even, God forbid, but I think we underrate depth when we're talking about the offseason. I've noticed that, I think, across the board because we watch the playoffs. It's all about the top 7, 8 guys. And we forget how often your 10th, 11th, 12th guy are going to get 20 minutes in a regular season game and swing an outcome. And we saw it when they went to Miami, like 3 games into the season. So that, I think, the depth is the reason that they've been in all these close games. They can afford for the starters to lose some minutes and work themselves back into it. So that's got to be pretty high on the list of positives and the thing I think I underrated about this team.
For sure. Like, yeah, that is a good thing to remember, right? Come playoff time, when everyone's going to roll their best guys 40 plus, it's going to be tough. And we're probably headed toward that also. But for now, it's not a mistake, or maybe it's, it just has happened to happen. Like some of the best guys, and I don't use plus minus for everything except for when it proves my point, but the Daron Sharp, Lonnie Walker, I mean, they've gotten massively positive minutes out of guys like that, just kind of in the aggregate now. And you're right. Like those, when they're able to sort of throttle other bench units, it's always going to have them at least in the game. Right. Yeah. I think that's part of what's going to keep things close. Now, on the offensive end, the ranking for them, I mean, their offensive rankings, I think you said this, and stop me if you already did, but like their offensive rankings are significantly higher than I thought they could ever get to this season already, right? Like just in terms of offensive efficiency, 3-point shooting, the areas that I think that maybe would have been concerns or just like benchmarks for being a good offense. So what have you seen from them so far this year? Like maybe even just from an X's and O standpoint that you think is helping contribute to, like, at least for me, maybe for you two, outperforming expectations on the offensive end?
I mean, I think it can get underrated that you have guys like Dorian and Royce just firing 8 to 10 threes a game. I mean, every night they're pretty much winning the math battle, and it's still a kind of a small sample. We're not even 20 games into the season, but they take a lot of threes and they're going in. And when you mix that with at least a baseline ability of whether it's been Cam Thomas on a heater, whether it's been when Ben Simmons was healthy and when Dennis Smith Jr. was also healthy, they were playing really fast no matter who was in the game. And we've gotten some really good Spencer Dinwiddie games. It's kind of been when one thing isn't working, somebody else has stepped up, whether it's, like I said, Dinwiddie controlling the half-court offense, pace, or just really strong shooting. And it's been hard for teams to guard. I mean, when they went through that stretch, 5 out, when they were playing Dorian at the 5, it was hard for teams to guard, and you'd have guys making strong, quick decisions. It's really a 3-point based offense, and the math has been to their advantage, and so is the shooting. I mean, it almost befuddles me at times. Like, I wish I had more than that, but I really don't as of right now.
Well, and I think that's fine too. And I think that will lead to like some frustrating moments for fans, right? Because I think there's a certain segment of fans that don't want to see just everyone chucking from the rafters every night, which I get to a certain degree. Like stylistically, that's not for everyone. And it can feel a little bit too much like make or miss. And that's just kind of going to tell the whole story. At the same time, it's really hard to argue with the strategy here, especially based on if we assume that their talent level is probably not up with some of the other major, other higher teams. At that point, embracing variance and living with the results is probably the right thing, even if it can look bad some nights, right? Because in the end, I just actually don't know if there's going to be a lot of other ways. If you're going to try to get into these half-court battles with other teams and you're not doing that, but they probably are just going to lose a lot of games.
I mean, one thing I've noticed too, this is where we're going to start to bring up maybe the major point of the season, which has been rebounding. I think that because they've cleaned up the defensive glass, I've seen they're I think the last time I checked, top 3 in isolation frequency, which you wouldn't expect. But a lot of these possessions they're getting rebounds, they're pushing, and it doesn't get counted as a transition possession, but they end up with a favorable matchup. Like a few times against the Bulls, they ended up with Lonnie Walker isolating on Nikola Vucevic.
Yeah.
And, if you're just in the half court, you have to work maybe over and over to get that matchup. The fact that they've been rebounding and pushing means they're kind of just stumbling into some of these matchups where they have guys with like McHale and Cam Thomas and Dinwiddie and Lonnie Walker. They're not going to lead the NBA as the best isolation players, but they're finding these matchups more and more. And it starts with, I think, the rebounding and the pace, which is a big reason for this offense success.
And if you watch it on a night-to-night basis, you can see them working their way through those progressions to try to get to that spot, right? Like, especially if they're not playing with a center on the court, you can see with Dinwiddie, it's usually the most obvious, but the other times you can see it's like, hey, once they notice that they have that mismatch, it's kind of clear out and cook time. And I think you're right. Like, they have just enough guys that can kind of do that at a plus level. And when you have more than when you have 3-4 guys that can do that, you will actually tax the defense. Want to get into some of this defensive stuff. Want to get into obviously some Ben Simmons a little bit later in the episode because it's all worth talking about. First, got to tell you about our friends over at eBay Motors. We've teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd, bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. It's your prepping for the daily drafts. You're just scouting the waiver wire every week. Going to give you the players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. Let's take a look at some of the eBay Guaranteed Fit fantasy picks of the week. Couple to get into this week. That's a really weird week with the schedule. The schedule is totally crazy this week. It's like 2 games, then 11 games, then no games, then like 50 million games, and it kind of goes on from there. But there are some guys you can kind of check in on, especially if you're doing season long. One guy to check in on, Orlando Robinson, got the start for Bam Adebayo the other night. Bam's supposed to miss another game. Robinson was really effective from a fantasy perspective, 16 points, 5 rebounds, 3 assists. Getting the start, pretty critical there for him in 29 minutes. You're going to want to check in where Orlando Robinson is in your league. Now, also the Bulls situation, Zach LaVine sitting out with the injury. We'll put that in quotes. We'll see how far that goes in terms of the trade season. But a couple other guys have stepped up over there. Obviously, Kobe White probably taken in your league, but Patrick Williams grabbing 29 minutes in the start, 14 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists. He's going to throw in some blocks and steals too. So you're going to want to check in on him as well. Just like you're going to want to check in their friends over at eBay with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. We can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it with eBay Guaranteed Fit. It's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus the prices, you're burning rubber, not cash, like what eBay did there. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right. Couple other things that just to try to just like sort of break down here. We talked a bunch, and I think, you mentioned it's like sometimes I don't see more than that in terms of the 3-point shooting. But I mean, I think you mentioned like there are other things that are kind of going on here. I think it's really important that you mentioned the rebounding as a critical piece that they've cleaned up. That was an absolute nightmare to watch last season. I mean, the second chance points were a disaster. They've cleaned up a decent amount of that. Have you seen them sort of taking a different approach here? Because if you look at this lineup, this roster on its face, obviously Claxton, Daron Sharp's really one of the best per-minute rebounders on both ends in the league. So maybe it's just as a matter of him just getting more minutes. But have you seen them taking sort of a different approach to rebounding? Because you can't just attribute it to 2 guys, and Claxton didn't play a ton, and yet all of a sudden this rebounding is just not the night-to-night nightmare that if you watched them every night last year, you wanted to just, I don't have any hair. You have lots. You wanted to just rip out your hair on a night-to-night basis.
I think it starts with the lack or the decrease in switching. We just don't really see guys like Dinwiddie having to box out and Thomas and whatever these guards be left on an island one-on-one boxing out against bigs. I mean, you'll see like the end of the Hornets game, the end of the Hawks game, they'll pull out like the ace in the hole. They'll switch Claxton on a Trae Young or Terry Rozier when they really need to stop. But until then, it's really a base drop defense, and we've talked about it. They help at the elbows aggressively, and that leads to them giving up a lot of threes. But teams aren't really getting in the paint as much, and the Nets are not in these wild rotations where they're switched on to unfavorable matchups on the glass. That combined with, maybe you could say an increased focus. Guys like when Claxton was out, Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith were just doing work, clearing out bodies in the paint. I think all of that has contributed to the success on the glass. But if I were to point to one thing, it would be the matchups are more stagnant. They're not in these frantic rotations as much. And that has led to just better, more favorable one-on-one matchups trying to get boards.
Okay, so that's a good transition then, because the defense, the rebounding, the strategy that might be paying off in one respect, I'm wondering if you're seeing it paying off across the board, because there's clearly the rebounding has improved, but the defense, even with sort of going the other way of the rebounding, like you look at the defense and you look at the individual cast of characters here, and you'd say, hey, this is something we can really, I mean, they said it themselves. Like Vaughn's like, hey, I thought we were going to have a really good defense and we don't. I think he's basically I'm summarizing what he said, but that's essentially what he said. Which is like, sometimes, it's not amazing to hear it come from the coach, but whatever. And where do you think the big problems are there? You mentioned I'd used the word aggression before, and you kind of threw water on that, which I think was correct, which is to say, like, it might not be overly aggressive. It might just be like sort of mismanaged, right? Like, finding like over helping in the wrong spots. And Lucas has done a really good job of breaking some of this stuff down, like places where there's been clear breakdowns in defensive connectivity and just sort of knowing where you're supposed to be. But what would you, if you had to like try to pinpoint what the major problem is, if you think there's one, about why this defense ranks, I mean, clearly in the bottom third of the league with a personnel that you would have thought it would have been definitely the opposite?
Yeah, I mean, the aggression topic is funny, and really it's a word that JV has used a lot, trying to up the aggression, take more chances, force turnovers, because they're not forcing any turnovers. And when you look at the math game over, the aggregate, that's just going to be hard to have a good defense when the opponent's getting a shot up every time. The help is so early a lot of the time, and that's what I've looked at. It really, I think, maybe feels aggressive, but in practice, it's a conservative defense, right? Because you have Nick Claxton dropping. You have the guard trying to get over the high pick and roll, the ball screen. And then you have these wing defenders helping so early, showing such early help at the paint, meeting the ball handler so early, where the ball handler isn't navigating through traffic. There's not a bunch of long arms and defensive activity. It's, okay, the help's in the paint. Nick Claxton's in drop. I'm looking at three guys, so let me just make an easy pass to the wing, and we're going to get an open shot. I think it is ultimately a pretty conservative style, which is all about protecting the glass. And while that's worked, it's not the kind of flying around, switching, utilizing all this length that you'd expect from this sort of defense. And I think, a guy like Claxton, unbelievable switcher, unbelievable perimeter defender, he's merely good in drop. He's not great. But I mean, again, that's not to diminish his ability. To be a great switcher and good in drop is very valuable. But I think guys are just getting used to this system that in a way is a little bit, unintuitive, because it's not very aggressive. It's pretty conservative, and, it's leading to open shots for the other team. But it's definitely interesting to watch. It's not what you'd expect.
Yeah, they rank right now. The Nets rank third to last in opponent 3-point attempts. So they are allowing a ton of these, and they rank, middle of the pack with how much the opponents are actually making. They're ranked 12th overall. So there could be a part where they're just also maybe even running like running lucky on that. I'm not sure based on the opponent, just overall, based on the overall sort of looks. And sometimes sort of like frantic closeouts because you stunted too early or whatever can look like aggressive behavior when it's actually just like you screwed up or you misread the situation. Is that a fair kind of like way to say that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there was one play in my mind from the Heat game where Cam Johnson is guarding Duncan Robinson, but he's helping so early and Duncan kind of relocates and Cam Johnson's like flying at him across the court and flies by, and then Duncan hits a three. And it looks aggressive, but it's kind of emanating from a more conservative style of defense. I don't think the being average in shooting percentage surprises me, because JV's talked about we're going to give up above the break threes, and they don't give up a ton of corner threes. So it makes a lot of sense, but it can be infuriating to watch when you see dribble penetration, one pass, open three. It's like, that doesn't look like a very active defense, does it?
And especially when it's like really, I mean, the Picasso version of that was the Hornets game, which looked like, like it looked like they were facing, peak Warriors, and they just had no idea where these guys were going to be. And then you're kind of thinking to yourself, like, how is this working? And I think some of that was sort of like a cascading effect too, where it's like they just kind of got going early, and then it felt like everything was just going to go in at that point. Do you feel like I want to get into Ben Simmons here in a second, but do you feel like, what you just mentioned on the defensive end is, I don't want to use the word correctable because I'm not sure if but is it improvable? Like, are there like basic fixes here where we could be 10 more games from now and the Nets you're saying to themselves, they actually have figured some of this stuff out. Like the communication's better. Everyone trusts each other a little bit more, maybe, right? Like you kind of trust that you don't need the help maybe in situations where, do you think we could see material differences just on time together on the court?
I think so. And I think you see it in some possessions where maybe it's, a more aggressive help in terms of, I'm just stunting or digging at the ball instead of just fully committing. Maybe Claxton keeps improving with the drop. I think we've all noticed his wind hasn't been as up as it was towards the end of last season. He's still working into shape. But I wouldn't honestly expect a huge change, because at the end of the day, they're accomplishing in many ways what they set out to do. The rebounding's way up, and they don't want to jeopardize that. And I think Nets fans can understand why that would be the case after the end of last year. And when you give up a bunch of above the break threes, you have more chances to run, because there's just going to be more missed shots than when you're shooting more 2-pointers. Just from a raw, volume miss or make, type of analysis, opponents miss more frequently, which allows more chances to run. So I think when you're thinking about this team and why they play defense the way they do, there's two things to keep in mind: rebounding, and they were very scared about getting into half-court offense too much. I mean, JV said it in plain terms, which is, like you said, pretty surprising to hear from a coach. He's like, we don't want to be in half-court offense. We want to prevent that as much as possible. And you're like, damn, okay, well, you're still going to be in it 75% of the time. So I don't doesn't inspire a ton of confidence, but he's right. He's
right. No, you're right.
So I think those are the two defining foundations of why this team looks the way it does.
I think we all appreciate the honesty. It's just sometimes it can shock you. And no, because you're like, yeah, I get it, right? They don't have this like super, super high end talent. It's like, but usually just coaches lie. So it's sort of better for your brand to just kind of give platitudes and then move on. All right, I want to talk a little bit of Ben Simmons here. Obviously, that's a big topic on everyone's minds. We will get to that in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Game Time. When it comes to buying tickets, concert, play, Nets game, you want to make sure that the ticket buying experience is fun. You don't want it to be a super hassle. You don't want to feel like you're not going to know what the price of something's going to be, or you're just going to show up and sit down at your seat and not really know what you're going to see from the seat. Game Time has figured all of this out. It's the fastest and easiest way to buy tickets for everything: sports, music, comedy, theater events near you. They got last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat. Like I said, right now, still time. You can head on over to Game Time. Washington Wizards at Brooklyn Nets, $9, starting at $9. I put that on the Wizards. It's the Wizards' fault, but you can take advantage of it. $9 starting over there. It's going to get a little pricier when you get to Knicks at Nets. That's starting at $90 at Game Time. But you go over to Game Time, you're finding the best deals. point, stop. What you got to do, you got to download the Game Time app. You have to create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You're going to get $20 off your first purchase. Do the math on what I just said about the Wizards. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. All right, final thing here, Ben Simmons. Now, just a point, Adam and I did a podcast. Luke, this podcast is going up Wednesday. Adam and I did a podcast Tuesday, which is not up at the time that Lucas and I are recording. That's just a little show note there. It's just so you can get the timing in case there's sort of like overlapping things that are said here about Ben Simmons. But I think it's worth it to talk to someone who's sort of been, in the building, talking to, these guys on a daily basis. I'll start here. When you saw Nets PR release the initial report on Ben Simmons, epidural, we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks. One, were you surprised at all, or could you kind of feel like that was the way this was trending, or like, so where were you before that even came out about like, hey, see you in a couple weeks and we'll get to you, but we'll get back to you then.
Yeah, that wasn't too surprising. I think in a previous press conference, JV had just said he's not doing really physical on-court work. Like he's just kind of shooting free throws, maybe some stationary ball handling drills. So that kind of let me know like he's not very close. So the epidural injection wasn't a huge surprise, but it didn't really change much for me. I mean, he's going to be reevaluated in 2 weeks, if he's not close to even, as in JV's words, sprinting up and down the court, this is probably, we're looking at months. Not months, but maybe not. I don't think he's going to be on the court in 2 weeks.
Well, we could go back. You can do retroactively. You can say months from when the original thing happened, Which is November 6th. We're already, by the time this goes up, we're already a month into it. Yes. So just tacking on one more month, which is totally reasonable, gets us into the plural. So yeah, I think that's a fine way to put it.
So in months, and then when you talk about months, we're in a very familiar place. And I wrote an article a couple weeks ago about, okay, I think this has to be the end of imagining relying on Ben Simmons as a focal point of this team. And that's not trying to obviously slander a guy who's going through a tough time with his back, whatever the case. It just, at this point, it doesn't seem feasible. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, this is going to basically, you could have just been the third person on the podcast from yesterday, because that's basically what we said was like any hope that you had held, where even like and I've seen a lot of these people in our mentions, because we were always on the, let's pump the brakes on the upside here until we see how this, really tough surgery and hard thing for a guy to do, especially for a really physical player that plays with pace, is this always going to be really, really hard. It's always going to be hard. But even when you compare it to like Michael Porter Jr., right, who had similar, he had a same procedure, right, the discectomy. He plays off ball a lot, right? Like he's an off ball guy. They don't rely on him for tons of defense. Like even Simmons just plays differently there. And I was always just concerned that even stylistically, this could rear its head, because he just plays in a really aggressive physical style. And that's hard when your back is screwed up. I don't really know another way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it's not only about the injury itself. It's about the style that he plays with. And we saw it in the first couple weeks. I mean, you could point to the pace, you could point to, I think, some net rating stuff, but it doesn't seem worth it. And I'm glad you brought this up, because something I forgot to say about the Nets offense, one reason I think it's doing much better this year is the spacing principles have made a lot more sense. So it's kind of stuff that I'm not noticing. It's like, there's less moments of I'm like, okay, why was Dorian Finney-Smith the guy rising and taking a movement three? Like, why were there two guys here? So the spacing makes a lot more sense. You introduce Ben Simmons into that, and it's just hard. And it's just Ben Simmons, Nick Claxton, to say nothing of the two as players, that's a tough solution for a modern NBA offense. And it takes time, and it takes a lot of reps together. And it just doesn't look like they're going to get those reps. And from what we've seen from both of those players in their Nets careers, it doesn't make a lot of sense to, not that you have to prioritize, but to prioritize Ben over Claxton when Claxton's impact just seems like much more of a sure thing. So beyond just the back. The fit on top of that makes this a much just less honestly appealing, motivating situation to rely on this guy to come back, and
I think it's probably time to at least just say, hey, if it happens, it happens, but we can't be doing long thought pieces anymore about like what it's going to look like or what it could look like when it gets to that point. There's just no trust. We said on the podcast yesterday, when at best he's played like something like 43% of the games over the last 3 years. And part of that, I get it. Part of that is he sat out the whole year with the Sixers, but he still did it. Like he still sat out. So it's like, it's on the resume. So I agree with you. And one thing, if you talk about the Simmons and Claxton piece, if you look at you have to slice and dice this a few different ways. Because if you look at them together over the whole, doesn't look too bad. But then when you back out Kyrie and KD, it looks like a total horror show. But you could probably tell yourself a story where it's like, okay, well, Bridges and Cam, like two good ISO scorers that can really cook, and can they just make and be on ball a lot? Could you live with it? Maybe it would be okay. But I think I agree with you. I think you just have to agree with you at this point that the part where it's going to come back in some 80% to 85%, whatever of his peak self, I think that's kind of over. Now, last question here. If you are the Nets, what do you do with Ben Simmons? Like, are you in a situation where I'm kind of putting you on the spot because I think most things I hope you can just decline to answer this, I guess. But if you have another year, you have, a year and 3/4 of a contract still of a huge contract. What do you do? Or is there even anything to be done with Simmons at this point?
That's the thing, because it's a good question without a good answer, because I don't really know that there is anything to be done. Like, right, there's mainly two paths. You can try to dump him, but why would you do that? Because he's clearly a negative asset. It's going to cost something to get off his contract. I think you only do that if you feel, okay, this is what's separating us from title contention. I'm not there with the Nets, as some fans might be. I don't think this is the year. I think it's a very fun year. I think it's good, nice to watch. I don't think this team is a Ben Simmons subtraction away from true title contention. So there's no reason to sink assets into something that feels like a short-term panic move. So you ride this season out. Now you get to next year. Who knows what happens? Is there a star that comes on the market that management feels like, okay, we add this guy, we're ready to compete? If you get to that point, then yeah, he's an expiring contract. The cost to dump him isn't going to be as much, but that is a ways away. I think right now you just ride it out. I mean, you're not in a position to act on this contract. So I think if he comes back, you integrate him, you probably bring him off the bench. It's I think a bit easier to envision his impact that way, but I think there's no big action to be made, whether that's trying to reinsert him as a focal point and change the identity of this team, because it's going to be like at least, I think, 2 months of an absence, and there's no reason to dump him either. So this is just kind of what it is for the Nets. And luckily it's a bit less stressful because it's not in go, we're competing for a title right now. There's plenty of other.
I was just gonna say, thank goodness they're good. Like what you said at the beginning to round it back. Like, thank goodness they are entertaining to watch. Like, sort of outside of this, because this would have been a real drag. Like, because you can see other teams going through this. Like I know they just lost to this team, so it's not the best example. But the Hornets lose Melo. It's like I know what this is gonna be. Now they beat the Nets on 50, 58, 100 shooting and barely won. Right. So but the Nets are thankfully not in that situation, even if sort of like that, this one part of the puzzle seems like it's cracked and you can't find the piece anymore. Okay. Lucas Kaplan over at Nets Daily. Check it out. He's writing about just about every game at this point and other stuff. So make sure you check out Nets Daily. Make sure you follow him at Lucas Kaplan _ over on the Twitter X, whatever we're calling it these days. Make sure you read him over at Swish Theory. He did a good piece on Jalen Johnson over there. Jalen Johnson got hurt like right away after Lucas published that. So do not write anymore. Write about other teams, guys, over on Swish Theory, if we're going to be okay with it. Lucas, thanks so much for coming by, man.
Thank you.
All right. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.